Design in the Department of Architecture and Design, and the Prince Walid bin Talal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud Center for American Studies and Research, I'm very happy to welcome among us Professor David Harvey, distinguished professor in anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Whether one calls him a Marxist geographer, an urban Marxist, or a social theorist, depending on one's relationship to his work, he's above all a brilliant mind engaging in thinking the world around us in the hope of transforming it into a just one. His work can be read as a dialectical engagement between geography and Marxian theory, a practice that has revolutionized both fields. To the mainly positive geography of the late 1960s, he brought concepts like social justice, social class, and capital that changed the field forever through books like The Urbanization of Capital, Social Justice in the City, and Social Justice in the City. More recently, in The Limits to Capital, Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference, he transformed Marx's historical materialism to a geographical historical materialism by showing the role of the urban process in the cycle of capital. The recent crisis, having started in the real estate market, has again proven the incisiveness of his insights. I will leave the floor for him to elaborate, but before that, I would like to thank very much Akhbar newspaper for supporting this visit, as well as the students and colleagues who were involved in advertising and organizing this event. Please join me in welcoming Professor Harvey.
Everything okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nada. And it's great to be here. And it's been a very good few days, and I've learned a great deal. And that's one of the purposes of visits of this kind. I want to talk about the situation as it exists in the global capitalist world right now. And in doing so, I want to try to talk about the specificities, but also to give some sense of what the general underlying nature of the problems are. There began actually around 2004, 2005 in the United States, a definite upsurge in the foreclosures which were occurring on people's housing. In those early years, nobody took much notice, for the very simple reason that the people affected were largely African American or Hispanic migrants. In many instances also single-headed households, which meant women. And the foreclosures were mostly concentrated in low-income communities in the older cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh. And as happened several times in US history, most terribly with the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the authorities took no notice, and the media took very little notice because the populations affected were not considered to be, quote, true American in the John McCain sense of that word. And Ronald Reagan, for example, refused ever to mention the word AIDS throughout the whole of his administration. And the terrible tragedy that arose out of that neglect was repeated, I think, by the fact that there was a neglect of the foreclosure problem when it could have been handled more easily around 2004, 2005. In 2006, there was a significant surge even above what had occurred before, and by 2007, you had a real serious epidemic of foreclosures, which now actually engulfed not only the older cities like Cleveland and Detroit, but could be seen in places like Florida, and in particular the American Southwest, California, and Arizona and Nevada. And in this instance, it was no longer African Americans and Hispanics who were getting caught. It was more white, middle class, Republican voters, and therefore people started to take notice. By the time you get to 2008, what appeared like a containable problem, as it was depicted in the press and by officialdom, had become a catastrophe, no longer containable. And we soon saw several of the major Wall Street investment banks going under, culminating in the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, which actually then had an impact globally on credit markets worldwide and, in effect, spread the crisis from these small epicenters geographically around the world in a cascading kind of fashion. Before Lehman went bankrupt, for example, the kind of commentaries you heard about the US crisis in Latin America, people would say things in Argentina like, well, finally it's happened to them, great. This is what happened to us in 2001, 2002, yay, good. Let them now feel what it's like. And they were saying things like that, the same as sorts of things were being said in Brazil. But after the bankruptcy of Lehman, all of a sudden Argentina started to feel it very badly. All of a sudden Brazil started to feel it very badly. By the time you got to the end of last year, the export-driven economies of East Asia were in serious difficulty, serious trouble. 20 million people lost their jobs in China in about 3 months. And Taiwan saw a huge drop in its exports, as did South Korea. The Japanese economy that was already stagnant went negative. And so we've seen, as it were, this cascading effect throughout Europe also. Finally, Germany and the stronger economies within the European Union got hit, as earlier on economies like Ireland, Britain, Spain got hit because they had also been involved in excessive engagement with property development. So it's, if you like, a geographical spread of this crisis, and how it hits at various places at various times depends very much on the positioning in the global economy in relationship to the forces of the crisis. One of the forces which is now actually having big impacts throughout the world is the drop in the flow of remittances from the Gulf states, which have also gone into decline now given the oil situation, and in the United States, Mexico, Haiti, Ecuador, places like that that depend very, very heavily upon remittances from the United States are suffering very, very considerably. And that suffering is going down right into the very impoverished neighborhoods. So there is actual starvation on the ground in Haiti, largely due to the fall-off in remittances from the United States. So I want to start out, if you like, with this notion of the geographical pathways of this crisis, in order to think a little about what its point of origin was, how it spread, and why it has spread so contagiously, and why it is that it seems very hard to find an easy path out of it. Because if we don't actually acknowledge the geography of it and how that geographical unraveling is occurring, then I think we will not be in a very good situation to try to figure out what it is might be done about it. Now, the interesting thing about this crisis is that it has, of course, occurred in some form many times over the last 30 years. Before 1970, financial crises were relatively rare in the capitalist world. Somebody did a count and said, between 1945 and 1975, there were maybe 50 of them, hitting various places in various times throughout the capitalist world. After 1975, however, we get a real radical transformation in the way in which the global economy is working, which many of us now refer to as the neoliberal turn. And the neoliberal turn has been associated with of highly volatile situation in which crises erupt very frequently. Somebody did a count, I don't know how accurate it was, and said there have been over 300 financial crises since the mid-1970s, and many of them have been localized and contained. For instance, the Mexican crisis of 1982, another Mexican crisis of 1995, Argentina in 2000, 2001, East and Southeast Asia in 1997, 98, Sweden in 1992. I mean, you just go around and you can sort of map the crises that have occurred. And the interesting thing about many of these crises is that they have, as this one has been, led by a problem in the property market, a problem of urbanization. And there is a curious way in which macroeconomic thinking tends to separate itself off from the study of urbanization as if it is a separate kind of question. When if you look at the dynamics of urbanization and the creation of financial crises over the last 30 years, you would see a very close association. For instance, the Swedish banks went bankrupt in 1992. Why? Because of excessive engagement in speculative activity in property markets. The Japanese economy crashed around 1989, 1990. Why? Because of excessive speculation, again, mainly in land markets, but also in property markets. The crash of 1997-98 in Southeast Asia had a very strong component of property market speculative activity involved in it. Within the United States, we have not been immune to this phenomena either. In 1987, 88, 89, there was a crisis in the savings and loan sectors that cost about $200 billion to bail out, a lot of money at that time. And also, I think it's important to recognize that the initial crisis of the 1970s in 1973 was largely triggered by a crash in property markets at that time. So there is, if you like, an association of some kind between property market and development and urban development, financial crashes, because most of that property market development is, of course, debt financed, and the debt financing becomes crucial, and the conditions of debt financing becomes crucial. And it's the financial institutions that have backed that urbanization project, which then have difficulty, and they then go under, and that then starts to, if you like, trigger the more general kind of crisis, which we've now see unraveling. So I want to make that point because there is nothing new about this crisis. It's happened several times before in the recent history of capitalism. And in fact, there are parallels way back, except that you wouldn't talk about property markets in the 19th century. You would talk about railroad speculation and speculative crashes around railroad development or something of that kind. So there's nothing new about this crisis, except that it is bigger and it is more, if you like, global than any of the others have been. The East and Southeast Asia crisis was, in fact, contained to East and Southeast Asia by a very narrow thread, it turns out. It could have easily have gone global, and it sort of did go global because it spilled over to Russia and the bankruptcy of Russia, and then that spilled over into Brazil and the bankruptcy in Brazil. So, in other words, there was a contagion effect there, but it was largely contained. This one has been very difficult to contain, partly because its main epicenter has been the United States. And one of the things that I noticed, and I mentioned the bankruptcy of Lehman as being crucial in this, that was the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers that actually sent the crisis global. And there's a very interesting kind of question which I keep on wanting somebody to answer, which is, was that a deliberate move on the part of the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve, because the crisis had become so deep in the United States that the only way in which they could do it was to globalize it, socialize it across planet Earth, and involve everybody in the mess? And was that a deliberate move? Because, in effect, that's what happened after Lehman Brothers, and it doesn't seem to me that you can simply say the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was a mistake. It could have been, but I really doubt that. I think it might have been a more strategic move on the part of the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve to send the crisis global to protect, in a way, the United States' interests. Now, there's something important to understand about crises. First off, this particular form of crisis, nothing new about it over the last 30 years. And of course, there's nothing new about the idea that capitalism is prone to crises. This one is being compared very much with the Great Depression of the 1930s. Another big one was, of course, the one that occurred, the stagflation crisis of the 1970s. So the history of capitalism is crisis-prone, and this then leads you to the question, could you have a capitalism that didn't have periodic crises? My answer to that is no, that actually crises have a very important role to play in the history of capitalism. They actually reconfigure capitalism, they reconfigure class relations, they reconfigure everything, so that actually crises become one of the mechanisms whereby capitalism actually reproduces itself and survives. When you go into a crisis, you usually have a very specific set of problems. What you then do is you find a set of solutions to those problems which create other problems, which then creates, as it were, a need to get out of that set of problems by a crisis, which then creates other problems. And so, in effect, we have a kind of a rolling history of crisis formation, which actually means that capitalism does a great job of moving its crisis tendencies around from one problematic to another problematic. And so the interesting question is, why is this crisis the way it is? And in order to understand that, you have to understand what the last crisis was about and how the last crisis unfolded and how the solutions to that crisis actually were the roots of the current crisis. Now, thinking about it that way then leads you to ask the question, in what ways are we, at this point, taking moves, and the political power apparatus taking moves to get us out of this crisis, only to put us into another crisis further down the line, and what kind of crisis will that be? And that seems to me to be one of the big questions we should be asking about the projects which are being proposed by those in power, the Obama administration, the G20 and all the rest of it. What kinds of solutions they're coming to with the present crisis which actually contain the seeds of the next one. And we should be thinking about that and saying, is that next one the one we want to live with or not? And maybe we should come out of it a different way than the way they are proposing. Now, as background to this, I want to make one other major point at the outset. And this major point is this, that capitalism is a system that is founded on growth. It grows all the time. And it grows for a very simple reason, that capitalists start the day with a certain amount of money. They then engage in all kinds of activities during the day, and at the end of the day, they hope to come out with more money. And a healthy capitalist society is one in which all capitalists are making a certain rate of profit, which means there is more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. Now, there's an interesting question as to what capitalists do with the capital that they've got at the end of the day. Now, if they were reasonable people like you and I, they would probably have a good time and consume it. But they can't do that because there's something else that actually prevents them from doing it. And it's a bit of a complicated story, but at the heart of it lies the fact that capitalists are subject to what Marx called the coercive laws of competition. If I, as a capitalist at the end of the day, don't take part of my profit and expand my business and somebody else does, then I will not be a capitalist much longer. So I have to reinvest part of my gains at the end of the day in expanding. My rivals are going to do the same, and they do. So the system in general expands on and on and on. Now this leads, if you like, to some very interesting features about the history of capitalism. The average growth rate since 1750, and there's a guy called Angus Maddison who spent years trying to figure out the data, and it's about as good as you can get. The average growth rate of capitalism since 1750 has been something like 2.25% per year. And some years, of course, it's been growing at 4 or 5%. In the 1950s and 1960s, on average, it was growing at 4 or 5%. In the 1930s, it was growing at 0%. Now it's growing at 0%. A little bit way ago, it was growing at 5%. So it goes up and down, but it averages out to 2.25% per year. And when you read the financial press and you listen to everybody talking and all of the institutions and all that kind of thing, they will say a 3% rate of growth is reasonable, it's acceptable. Less than 3%, people start to say the economy is sluggish. Only 1% growth, people start to say this is serious and it's getting towards recession. And of course, zero growth is real, for very long, is real depression. So, if you like, the target that has to be hit by capitalist growth is going to be 3%. And it was interesting, Obama the other day said that his aim was to try to get the economy back on a 3% growth path in the next couple of years. Gordon Brown said exactly the same thing. Now, what does 3% compound growth give you? Well, here, let me read you Angus Madison's calculations on the size of the global economy. In 1750, the total economy, that's the amount of goods and services passing through the market and market exchange, that's the measure of it, was something like $165 billion. By 1820, it was $694 billion. By 1913, it was $2.7 trillion. By 1950, it was $5.3 trillion. By 2003, it was $41 trillion. Now, these dollars are normalized to 1990 dollar values. The last World Bank report in current dollars said the global economy was $56.2 trillion. And the United States had about $14 trillion of that in itself. Now, 3% growth in, say, 1950, when you had a $5 trillion economy, is very, very different from a 3% growth rate on a $50 trillion economy. Because what that means is you need to find something like $1.5 trillion of new investment opportunities if you're going to grow at 3% from now on. If the economy doubles, as it would if by 2030, you'll be finding an investment opportunities for $3 trillion of new money looking for things to do. This is a tall order. It's a very tall order. And actually, if you think of it physically, when capitalism was constituted by everything that was going on in Manchester and Birmingham and a 50-mile radius around there and a few other hotspots in 1750. That's one thing. But now we're talking about this enormous kind of 3% growth on almost everything that's going on in East and Southeast Asia, much of what's going on even now in India and of course Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America. I mean, 3% compound rate of growth on all of that forever strikes one as not only a tall order but downright impossible. What this leads to are periods in the history of capitalism when the following phrase crops up. And this you will find in International Monetary Fund reports right the way throughout the late 1990s into just recently. The world is awash with surplus liquidity, which means there's too much money looking for things to do and it's having a hard time finding anything to do. This was happening in the late 1960s, 1970s even. I remember when the banks actually were basically knocking on your door and say, for God's sake, come up with a project. And you say, well, I haven't really got one. Well, make one quick and we'll lend you money. Now, but that's exactly what was happening in the foreclosure, in the subprime lending. For God's sake, borrow money. I mean, we've got all this money, we don't know what to do with it. For God's sake, somebody buy a house. And it's great if the house is going up in value, yeah, fine. I mean, the world is awash with surplus liquidity, and there's been a surplus liquidity problem around, I would argue, since around 1950, but it's got more and more serious after the 1970s. And there's been this incredible difficulty about how to invest productively all of the surplus liquidity. And one of the ways you can look at the financial crises that have gone on is to say, well, actually, since nobody could find any place to put the surplus liquidity, what you had to do was to wipe out the surplus liquidity through a financial crisis. The latest estimates from the IMF and the World Bank suggest that actually last year the global economy lost something like $55 trillion in asset values. You'd actually wiped out 55 trillion. That's about 1 year's productive activity. You wiped it out. And of course you wiped it out in Argentina, and you wiped it out in Mexico, and you wiped it out in East and Southeast Asia. You wiped it out even in the United States in the stock market crash of 2001. $7 trillion were lost in a year and a half. So in effect, what we're seeing is this kind of surplus liquidity, a capital surplus absorption problem that doesn't find a way out into anything productive because there are too many barriers to expanding productive activity. So you start to play games in the financial sector. And so we start to get this rhythm of financial crisis after financial crisis. But that general problem has to be set against the immediate problems which are seen to be at the heart of a particular financial crisis at a particular historical moment. In the 1930s, many people eventually decided that the big problem in the 1930s was a problem of effective demand, the lack of demand in the marketplace. And therefore there was a big debate on how to stimulate effective demand so that that effective demand could then absorb the surplus product that capitalists were producing. Tremendous productive capacity there in the 1930s, but no market to sell it to. What were you going to do? And the answer was, of course, something called Keynesian theory, which was debt financing, deficit financing of government expenditures. And the debt financing and deficit financing went into things like infrastructural projects, like highways and building dams and things of this kind, Tennessee Valley Authority, all those sorts of things. So infrastructural projects were part of what had to happen. So the 1930s saw this problem and sought to get out of it, but there was an incredible nervousness about deficit financing. Roosevelt didn't want to deficit finance too much. He was fearful of the amount of debt that might be incurred. So he actually cut back on state expenditures in 1937, 1938, which was the result of which the Great Depression just came back again, bang. What got the United States out of the Great Depression was, of course, World War II. No lack of effective demand. The barriers to deficit financing were completely broken, so the deficits went way, way, way up. And that solved the problem. And everybody in the United States now talks about how World War II effectively solved the problem. So that then raises one of the questions, well, who are we going to go to war with this time in order to deal with this problem? But, of course, the Second World War was only an interim solution. The big solution came after 1945 in the United States by suburbanization of the United States. That is, debt financing of the suburban development of the United States played a crucial role in rescuing the United States economy from plunging back into the kind of depression it had had in the 1930s. And this did involve a whole kind of radical reform of the urban process, a radical reconfiguration of home ownership and financing of home ownership and all the rest of it. And so actually the suburbanization of the country had all kinds of meaning in terms of solving the effective demand problem, because it wasn't only the highways and the cars and the two cars in the garageway. You also needed, I kind of ask students, so where do you think the demand for lawnmowers came from in the 1950s? Now, if you live in the city in a dense place, you don't have a need for a lawnmower, but what they created was, of course, demand for lawnmowers. So if you were a suburban dweller, you had to have a lawnmower. And so you get a kind of big lawnmower industry. So the whole way of life changes around the suburbanization of the United States, which is a very brilliant way of dealing with the problem. But, of course, it rested on cheap oil. In 1945, the United States was fairly self-sufficient in oil. By the time you get to 1970s, it's no longer self-sufficient in oil. It's beginning to have to import from outside. And now what do we find? We find the United States is heavily, heavily dependent upon foreign oil. Also, suburbanization is a disaster from the standpoint of global warming. And if you want to do something about global warming, you better sort of actually demolish the suburbs and actually start all over again in terms of urban design. So actually, a lot of the problems we've now got are actually rooted back in that particular kind of period. Added to which, of course, people started to actually like their suburbs. So nobody in the United States actually wants to give up their suburban lifestyle. So they want to see a solution to the environmental problem, but they don't want to give up their suburban lifestyle. Go figure. There's no way you're going to be able to do that. So these are the sorts of issues that seem to me, in the long run, you start to see they kaleidoscope into each other in these peculiar kinds of ways. So the United States got out of this, but the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s were immensely strong growth periods in all of the advanced capitalist societies. I'm talking about 4 or 5% average growth from about 1945 to about the end of the 1970s, end of the 1960s. But by the end of the 1960s, this begins to break down, and it breaks down around certain kinds of problems. That effective demand, which was being generated in suburban, relied upon the fact that labor was going to get a good chunk of the surplus that was being produced. In other words, the effective, people can't buy 2 cars unless you give them the income to buy 2 cars. So working people, particularly in leading industries, like automobiles, steel, were going to get paid very well, and they were going to get paid higher and higher. And they became pretty strong politically, and wage rates went up. And this was greeted by the main corporations, which were essentially monopoly corporations, by simply raising prices. So towards the end of the 1970s, you get rising wages, rising prices, and you start to get the inflation problem beginning to emerge. Even more important, as the inflation problem emerges, the profit rate of corporations starts to go down. And they find themselves then becoming involved in a huge confrontation with labor. The late 1960s to about middle of the 1970s was a period of pretty violent confrontation between capital and labor almost everywhere in the advanced capitalist world, in Europe and in the United States. And labor was very strong, was very well organized, was politically powerful, and the capitalists were getting less and less of the profit they felt they'd needed. There was, if you like, a capitalist class crisis. They were threatened by the power of labor, and they had to do something about it. Well, what do you do when labor's too powerful? Well, there are a number of things you can do. First off, you can open up the country to immigrants. And actually, in 1965, there was a big reform of immigration law in the United States that actually then allowed people from all over the world to come to the United States, as opposed to just from the European countries that were, Caucasian and privileged. So the 1965 law did that. In Europe, for example, the Germans brought in the Turks, the French brought in the Maghrebians, actually had programs to bring the Maghrebians in. The British drew upon their once upon a time empire. The Swedes brought in people from Yugoslavia. I mean, there was a deliberate import of a large number to deal with the labor problem. But if that didn't work, then of course what you did is you started to export capital and take your production overseas. Now you couldn't do that unless you had a revolution in transport relations. And the big revolution that occurred in the middle of the 1960s was something called containerization. After containerization came, transshipment costs at ports fell dramatically, and you could make your engines in Brazil and put them in the cars in Detroit, and it was, you know, a pretty efficient sort of system. So you could start to globalize and, as it were, and create the global car, the global television set, all those sorts of things. The other thing you could do was, of course, to invent people like Reagan and Thatcher and Pinochet and Herbert and Kohl and people like that, whose main task was to politically attack labor. And to do that, you needed, if you like, an ideological standpoint which basically said too much power of labor is wrecking the economy. Capitalists never wreck the economy, by the way. Have you ever noticed that? It's always somebody else who did it, you know. Well, in this case, it was labor that was doing it, and labor had to be disciplined. So there is this fierce attack upon labor by Reagan and Thatcher, and of course in Argentina by the military and by Pinochet in Chile and all the rest of it. So it's this fierce attack, which is attempting to disempower labor. And by the time you get to the mid-1980s, it's pretty much succeeded. You cannot suggest at this moment that there's anything about this crisis that has anything whatsoever to do with the excess power of labor in labor markets globally. Not at all. In fact, if anything, it's the other way round. The problem is that labor has not been getting enough. And you're back into the 1930s story, where the lack of effective demand on the part of the mass of the population is really insufficient to absorb the surplus product that's being created. And so we start to find that problem emerging. But and it's a very interesting kind of, as labor gets disciplined, we go through 30 years of what are in effect what we call wage repression. And it's a global wage repression. Capital is going to wherever the wages are lowest. Even China now is having problems because it turns out wages are lower in Cambodia and Vietnam, and so there's offshoring from China into Cambodia and Vietnam. Actually, was offshoring from, it's interesting, there's offshoring from Japan into China and Taiwan into China and South Korea into China, and now it's hopping. So as you do that, you go into this lower and lower wage rate regime, and so we have this global kind of wage repression going on, and wages are stagnant. Capitalist productivity is rising a bit, significantly in some instances through automation and all the rest of it. So how are you going to sell your product? And the answer is, get out your credit card. That is, you start to debt finance the consumption of the mass of the population. You do it via the invention of the credit cards, which comes in the 1970s, big time. You start to play games with the credit card economy, and you start to do it also on other things too, like housing finance and the rest of it. The result is that in the United States, and the same would be true of Britain, household debt tripled from about 1980 to 2004, 2005. And that tripling of debt, so what that does is to sort of get a situation where wage rates are flat, the debt is going like this. Now, at some point or other, that's fine until somebody says, well, we should really call in this debt and somebody should pay it off. In which case, people use another credit card to pay off that credit card, and and everybody runs around trying to find another source. So the whole thing is getting very unstable simply because the effective demand in the market is entirely consumerist, debt financed. No longer actually financed out of current wages at all. And that starts to be one of the serious problems. The second serious problem arises with what the capitalist class began to do as it got more and more of the surplus product under its command. Because again, under the neoliberal regime, what happened was the rich got immensely richer and the poor remained just poor. And that meant that actually the gap between, for instance, the aggregate earnings of the CEO of a company was something like 30 to 1 in 1970, and by the time you get to about 2002, it's up to something like 400 to 1. And in some instances, some years it even went even higher, depending on the bonuses, sometimes 600 to 1. It's now back to around 350 to 1. So the rich are getting immensely richer. And on top of that, we get a political theory that says that's good. Why? Because the rich, when they get money, invest. And if they invest, that creates jobs. Okay. We're now hearing a bit the other way around, which is, well, we've got to give the workers more because they're the ones who buy, so maybe we should do it that way around. But right throughout the neoliberal era, it was, give the rich the money and they'll invest. But there's an interesting question. What did they invest in? And how did their investment strategies work? Now, I mentioned earlier that actually during the 1960s, you had a situation where industries were often monopoly industries. And oligopoly, really. Detroit was a very good example. 3 major auto companies, no real rivals, wages are going up, prices are going up. You don't get collusion, you get what they call price leadership. One company raises its prices by 4%, the other does it by 4%, and then the third does it by 4%. You get to the 1980s, the Japanese companies are there, the German companies are there, the Italian companies are there. And so you suddenly find that Detroit is being competed with fiercely. And it's cost competition, and they have to start actually reducing their prices in order to compete with the foreigners. And the foreigners have an advantage. They don't go into the highly unionized states of the United States. They go to states like Tennessee and Alabama that are fiercely anti-labor. So they don't have the same labor contracts. And so Detroit and the rest of the country, auto production gets divided. And I don't know if you've noticed, any of you followed this business of General Motors and Chrysler. The senators from Tennessee and Alabama have fiercely, fiercely resisted any bailout of the Detroit auto companies, which actually does not hit workers extremely hard. Why? Because in their states, where Toyota, BMW and all the rest of it are, they have a different labor regime. So in effect, what's happening is you're imposing the labor regime of Alabama and Tennessee upon Michigan through the kinds of actions that are going on right now. So this heightened competition starts to lead to price wars amongst many elements within the capitalist production system. Things become much more fiercely competitive. And because of that, more money starts to flow into production, but in such a way as to drive the profit rates down. In other words, surplus liquidity goes into production, increases the number of cars that are being made, increases the number of iPods or whatever it is, or chips being made, and so the prices start to come down. So you end up in a very peculiar economy by the time you get to the mid-1980s. It's an economy in which there's a low wage rate and there's a low profit rate. Usually what you would get is a low wage rate and a high profit rate. But here you start to get, because of heightened competition, low wage rate, low profit rate. So why would a capitalist, somebody who controls a lot of money, invest their money in production where the profit rate is low? The answer is, well, you look for something else to do with your money. What do? You invest in assets. Now, asset values are extremely interesting in this way. The stock market is a case in point. People invest in stocks and shares. And it's supposedly such that when you invest in stocks and shares, you invest in such a way that you get a portion of the future revenues of that corporation. So you invest on expectations of future revenues. Now, expectations are funny things. You guess. It's the psychology of the market that comes in important here. So you invest in the stock market, and because you invest in the stock market goes up. And other people think, oh, things must be getting better, so I better invest in the stock market. So they invest in the stock market, and the stock market goes up even further. And then other people invest in the stock market, and so it goes on. So a stock market has what we call a Ponzi character to it, without having a particular person engage the Ponzi scheme. And this happens also in the property market. Invest in property. Property prices go up, and people say, well, hey, this is a good thing. Prices go up even more. This is better. Property prices keep on going up. So asset markets sort of have this character of actually being bubble prone. The same is true of the art market. You look at the prices of Picassos, for example. I mean, all of the rich folk on Wall Street were buying Picassos and Monets. It's a good time, by the way, to buy Monets right now, because several of them are having to sell out. So if you've got a few $1 million and you fancy buying a Monet, you may get one cheap right now. So they started to invest in asset values, and then they found there were other channels which were being invented where they could get even more money by investing in derivatives and investing in financial gains. Because one of the ways in which it was absolutely necessary for the global economy to go global in the 1970s was to deregulate financial flows in financial markets. So you get this deregulation of these markets. And these markets then start to actually bubble, as it were, and offer all kinds of opportunities. Derivatives on currencies, derivatives on credit, derivatives on all sorts of things. And you could make money by playing the following kind of game. The Japanese economy in the 1990s was very depressed. The Japanese central bank reduced the interest rate on loans to close to zero. So you could borrow money in Japan at 0%. You could then take that money to London and get 6%. Why would you bother putting it into industry, which got you 2%, when you could get 6% by doing that? But you had to be careful about what the exchange rate was between the yen and pound sterling. And that then was one of the key kind of questions that led into currency hedging. Because if the exchange rate went against you, you'd lose all of that 6%. So what you did was you bet on that. If it did that, then you would actually recoup everything. So you then get this vast betting schemes that start to be concocted on Wall Street, in which the capitalist class starts to make money off fictitious capital. It's fictitious in the sense that nothing particularly underpins it. And that then becomes, if you like, part of the way in which the asset bubble took over. Asset investments took over from investments in real production, which were having a very hard time for the reasons that I've already mentioned. So all of this comes together in a particular kind of circumstance, which was the foreclosure circumstances. And that came about in a very particular way. But I think the story I'm telling you would say if it had not come about in the particular way of the foreclosures, it would have come about in another way. In other words, we were headed for something of this kind simply because the gap between what real wages were and what the debt encumbrance was getting unsustainable. The amount of money that was now circulating in derivatives markets had become astronomical. I mean, I got scared, and it was back in 2004, when there was a little item in the newspaper and it kind of said somebody had calculated the amount of money that was circulating through derivatives markets, and it was something like $340 trillion. And I thought, $340 trillion, the total output of the global economy is, as I mentioned just recently, $56 trillion. That is, the derivatives market was circulating way, way, way more in the way of asset values than was actually ever being produced in the economy. And the article ended up by saying, well, you know, you shouldn't worry too much because actually the real liabilities in that market, because there's a lot of churning, the real liabilities are only 10% of that total. And I thought, 10%, that's still, you know, $37 trillion or something like that out of $56 trillion. This is a hell of a whack you may take if this comes down. The last data I saw suggested that as of last summer, $600 trillion was moving through these markets. Now, these markets did not exist in 1990. I mean, you look at the graph of them, it just goes like this. Talk about a compounding, it's a radical compounding rate of growth. And real money was being extracted from that. And that money being extracted from those markets was coming from somewhere, was coming from somebody. And somebody was making something, somebody was doing something. Where was the money coming from? The only clue I could get was that in January 2008, the total bonuses on Wall Street came to $32 billion. That's personal remuneration, $32 billion. And I was pretty outraged because it seemed to me $32 billion was rather a lot of money to be given for crashing the world's financial system. I mean, if I could fail like that, wouldn't you like to fail too? And those bonuses were only 2% less than the year before. And nobody got outraged at the time. I was outraged, particularly since at that time already 2 million people had lost their homes. And it had been the biggest asset loss in the African American population of the United States ever. Their assets had effectively been totally wiped out. Now, I sometimes like to talk about what I call accumulation by dispossession. This seems to me to be one massive movement of dispossession of a vulnerable population and a repossession of all that wealth at the top. And of course, if you say that in the United States, people say, oh, but you're talking class, and classes don't exist in the United States. You kind of go, oh, come on. I mean, it is just astonishing that that transfer of wealth passed by unremarked, politically, economically. But it was a massive transfer of wealth. Now, this system then gets into the difficulties that it's got into. The crash and all the rest of it. So what is the answer? The answer is bail out the banks. Now, interesting, I'm often asked, does this whole disaster mean the end of neoliberalism? My answer is, well, it depends what you mean by neoliberalism. My definition of neoliberalism was it was a class project to try to recuperate class power and class wealth. And it started in the 1970s. And it had an ideology which it used largely to disguise the nature of the class project. And the ideology was about freedom of the markets, individual liberty, privatization, free markets, free trade, personal responsibility, getting the state out of social provision, and all those kinds of things. It's a very convenient ideology because, as Marx showed long ago in Capital, that when capital gets towards the perfection of the liberal model, as Marx understood it, then it simply means that the rich grow immensely richer and the poor grow much poorer. And we've been through, if you like, 30 years of exactly that. So the neoliberal project, if you like, was about accumulating wealth. In so doing, there were two basic principles which became part of the pragmatic core of what neoliberal economy was about. The first pragmatic principle was you protect the financial institutions at all costs. If there's a conflict between the well-being of the financial institutions and the well-being of the people, you choose the well-being of the financial institutions. This was first devised in Mexico in 1982 in the debt crisis in Mexico. Mexico was about to go bankrupt. If it went bankrupt, all the people that had lent the money would have really suffered. Who had lent the money? The New York investment banks. Whose money had the New York investment banks lent to Mexico? The Saudi money, the Gulf oil money, which had been recuperated by New York after the 1973 war. There was a sort of a deal struck between the United States and Saudi Arabia that said all of the oil monies will recycle through the United States and through the Wall Street investment banks. And while we are not certain, the British intelligence documents from the time suggest that there was a very strong possibility that the United States was threatening military invasion of Saudi Arabia at that time, unless they put the money back into New York. So the way then the system approached the Mexican debt crisis was to say, we've got to bail out the New York banks. Otherwise, we'll be in real trouble. The whole US imperial project will be in trouble, and the banks will be in trouble. So what do? We actually reinvent the International Monetary Fund and something called structural adjustment, put it together with the power of the Treasury, and we go to Mexico and we say, all right, we'll bail you out, but you have to visit austerity upon your population. The standard of living of the mass of the population of Mexico declined by about 25% in about 6 years after 1982. So you're socking it to the people while saving the banks. What policy do we actually have happening right now in the United States? We are saving the banks and socking it to the people through unemployment, through debt financing on the taxpayer's expense. We're doing this exactly the same thing. In other words, this is, if you like, the perpetuation of the neoliberal project as a class project. And there is actually no class force which is in position to stop it at this moment, at this time. And therein lies the problem. Because if we're going to come out of this crisis in a continued neoliberal way, then we are going to get back into a crisis in a neoliberal way. Now, there's a very interesting kind of comment that Andrew Mellon made back in 1913. He was a banker and he became Secretary of the Treasury. And he said, in a crisis, assets return to their rightful owners, i.e. him. And what we're seeing right now is actually a consolidation of capitalist class power. We have about 4 major banks left on Wall Street. Actually, some of the people on Wall Street are doing very well right now. Last year, the leading hedge fund managers made nearly $3 billion each in personal remuneration in 1 year, betting on the collapse of the US economy. Tremendous rate of return. And so, in fact, the idea that somehow or other capitalist class is being hit by this, well, yes, some of them are. There's a rationalization going on. You're moving away from a highly competitive model to a much more monopoly kind of model. In other words, the heightened competition we've been through over the last 30 years is being attenuated and diminished by the rise, if you like, of monopoly power within the financial system. And increasingly, what we're seeing in, say, automobile sector is increasing monopolization of control. So monopolization is going to be part of the answer. But monopoly control on the part of a smaller and smaller segment of a very, very powerful capitalist class, which is, in effect, going to continue the politics of the neoliberal era, but it cannot now use the terms of justification. All of the rhetoric about freedom of the market and how free markets are good for you, free trade is great, everything, you know, you can't, and the state should not interfere. You can't say that anymore and get away with it. They have to come up with a new legitimation. And this, therefore, creates, it seems to me, a very interesting moment, which is that the legitimacy of this system is seriously in trouble. The problem is seeing what lies at the heart of this system and what needs to be addressed. And what needs to be addressed is this issue that I've started out by talking about, which is the capital surplus absorption problem. How are you going to actually imagine a 3% compound rate of growth for the next 100 years? How are you going to imagine that? The stresses on environment are already pretty astronomical. The sociological stresses are there. The financial stresses are all around us. So you have to start to think about what kind of political economy can replace this, and on what terms should it be constructed. Now, the capitalist class is not going to do it, obviously. They're going to do some reforms. They're going to put in, some degree of regulation and re-regulation, all of those sorts of things. But they're not going to do anything fundamental to change the system, because it's their system and they're benefiting from it immensely. And they're going to try, if you like, to re-stabilize it in their terms. My concern right now is to say, well, where is the political opposition which is going to say, no, you can't re-stabilize it in your terms. Those are too costly for us. They're too costly in relationship to the environment. They're too costly in relationship to geopolitical and other tensions. And under those circumstances, it seems to me absolutely crucial that a political awareness be constructed, a political movement be constructed that starts to actually talk about some alternative to the growth mania that has driven capitalism since 1750 or so. Now, this is a long-term project. It requires a lot of careful thinking, because transitions are awkward, they're difficult. We are seeing transitions right now going on in different parts of the world, and I mentioned the geographical differences. We are seeing transitions. China is responding to this crisis in a very different way than everybody else. They are responding to it largely by beginning to turn towards the creation of an internal market rather than an export market. As they do so, it's going to have a radical impact upon the balance of global power relations and a radical impact upon the way in which the dynamics of capitalism works. It's almost certainly going to lead to the United States losing its hegemonic position in terms of global capital. It's almost certainly going to lead to serious environmental problems, because the Chinese are not going to be bothered too much about global warming and all of that kind of stuff, given the fact that you've got 20 million unemployed and you've got social unrest looming all around you. You're not going to talk about those kinds of things. So you're going to get an uneven geographical response to this crisis condition, which is going to create a lot of geopolitical stresses. And the question of oil, of course, is there all the time, and we see what's going on in terms of oil markets and the volatility and all the rest of it. So there has to be, if you like, some very coherent thinking given. And one of the difficulties I find right now is we have whole universities that are populated by people who call themselves economists who haven't the faintest clue what to do, and haven't the faintest idea what the nature of the problem is, and who give you technocratic kinds of solutions about this or that, who even say, well, the problem in the past was not that markets didn't work, it's just that they were not perfect enough. So we really need to make them much more perfect, and then everything will be all right again. So there's an ideological, intellectual barrier which is involved here, and an ideological battle to be fought, and it is going to have to be fought in the universities. And in the United States, I can't speak for here or in other countries, in the United States, the hegemony inside of the universities is so dominated by neoliberal thinking at all levels that it's very, very difficult to imagine actually the universities being the centers of the pursuit of some alternative. An alternative is possible. There are ways of thinking about alternatives. But you can't do it without first recognizing the nature of the problem. As Marx once said, well, okay, our problem is not to understand the world, but to change it. Yes, that's correct. But it's very hard to change it if you don't understand it first. And I think the understanding of what the dynamics of this crisis has been about is absolutely crucial. Which is why it is that people like myself have to spend, I think, a great deal of time trying to wrestle with the details and figure out what the dynamics are in order to get some sort of sense of what the possibilities are for real transformations and where those real transformations might come from, given that the situation in China is not the same as the United States. And it is those alternatives that it seems to me we need to be discussing, and I haven't had time to talk about my ideas about them, but I think what I wanted to lay out here was, if you like, the general explanation of where the crisis came from, what the nature of the problem is, because in those terms we might be in a position to do something about it. Thank you very much. Actually, there's more resistance, I think. You don't find it too much in the universities. What you do find is, and I think over the last 10 years, there's been really an upsurge of social movement activism at all kinds of levels. It's very difficult, actually, to get a global sense of what this might be. For instance, in Latin America, there is a tremendous amount of ferment. Different positionalities of Chavez versus Lula versus Bachelet and Kirchner and so on. But certainly throughout Latin America, about 80% of Latin America, there is a strong sense that an alternative to the neoliberal project has to be found. Some sort of alternative. At the moment, the steps are tentative and all the rest of it, but at least there's a lot of activism. And of course, there are movements in Latin America like the landless peasants movement, which is extremely strong and very powerful. There are movements in Mexico like the Zapatistas and so on that are proposing alternatives. So there are social movements around of various kinds in various parts of the world which are very active. There's a lot of unrest in many parts of India. We even have a communist government in Nepal, I mean, there's some very interesting things happening. In the United States, we don't have a mass movement, but there's a lot of very local activism, usually directed to very specific issues. And one of the things that I've been involved with is trying to get people to talk about the right to the city as an umbrella way of bringing together many activist movements involved in urban struggles around the idea of a more coherent kind of objective. What happened, independent of what I was thinking about, what I was doing, was that several movements in New York City got together to form something called the Right to the City Alliance. These movements have alliances also with groups in Miami and Washington and so on. So it's a beginning of if you like, of an attempt to create much more unity amongst disparate social movements, and it's a difficult process, as you can imagine. But on the one hand, I'm very optimistic about the direction it's going, because all of the social movements now say something which I never heard them saying before, which is that we cannot get what we want on our own. We need to be in alliance with others so we have sufficient power to really alter the nature of the system. Also, for the first time in much of my lifetime, well, not first time, because there have been other periods when this was true, the social movement people are very anxious to talk with those people inside of the universities who are interested in this kind of activism. So we have, in my own group, an active, ongoing discussion with the social movements around the right to the city theme, which is one of my particular interests, and so there is a dynamic there. Yes, it looks pretty bleak in terms of turning this into a mass social movement. But things have to move at a certain pace in the case of a legitimation crisis. If you look back, again, 1929, there was a stock market crash. The real pressure, political pressure, didn't occur till 1932-33. It took about 3 or 4 years for things to start to really go in a, really strongly, push Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt did not want to do a lot of things he did, but by the time he came to power, he got pushed. Obama's come in, he needs to be pushed. He's not going to do anything other than save the system in its own terms unless he's pushed. But he is at least the kind of president who, like Roosevelt, I think, if the push comes, will probably respond. But he has to be pushed. And it's going to take some time to do it. So it's really a moment of transition. And I think the legitimation question is very, very significant. I mean, it's very hard for people to kind of say the system we had was a perfect system. Capitalism is great, and capitalism is victorious, and look what a wonderful world we have. It's difficult to say that right now. And with unemployment, and again, unemployment levels are still rising. And when unemployment's only got to 8 or 9%, that's not even got as high as it was in the Reagan recession, which was 10%, and nowhere near the 15, 17, 20% it was back in the 1930s. If unemployment continues to rise, if the system continues not to respond, then within 2 or 3 years, I think you will see a very rapid rise of social movement activism. And these things are very volatile. In the United States, for example, who would have thought that Obama would be president 3 years ago? People like that will rise up and start to make, there will be a political movement building around. And in the United States, people will rise up, I think, and take it leftwards rather than rightwards. In Europe, I think it may more likely go right-wing rather than left-wing. So you're never quite sure which way it's going to go, but I think in the United States it will tend to go left because we've had enough of the right wing in charge for some time. They're too discredited right now. So the dynamics are there. The environmental questions are also kind of crucial, but you notice that most of the solutions being proposed are technocratic solutions, not about lifestyle, not about reconfiguring social and political life. There are some who want to talk in those terms. So yeah, the alternatives, however, are being proposed, are being worked upon, and there are all kinds of initiatives in various parts of the world about we have to do things differently on the municipal levels. There's a lot of experimentation going on, so I wouldn't be sort of too depressed about the idea there's nothing going on, because there's a lot going on. The question is, how is it going to be brought together, and in what ways will it actually mount a real challenge to the centers of class power and what they're able to do? And that is going to be, it's a daunting challenge. But on the other hand, they don't have a legitimate argument right now to continue doing what they're doing in the way they're doing it. And they are continuing to pay themselves bonuses, as we see, as if somehow or other they have a right to that. And many people have even, the populist level kind of almost saying they don't have a right to that. I mean, why should they receive that level of remuneration for just cleaning up the mess they made? So there is a kind of just an interesting political moment, but we are at the beginnings of this process, not anywhere far along.
First of all, I want to thank you. That's one of the best explanations explanations I've heard of why we're in this mess, so thank you very much. I guess my criticism would be that you didn't spend enough time telling us what we all can do. You did part of it. And I'd like to say that part of the mess that we're in, Adam Smith said that capitalism is based on a moral foundation. You break that moral foundation, it doesn't work very well, and we've broken it. And my brother, who's a longtime bank president, said the problem is greed. And so we've got a lack of ethics, a lack of greed, we have too much greed, and it's very political. Take George Soros, for example. You mentioned $3 billion. 2 years ago, he made $6 billion. And when Democrats, I'm a Democrat, when Democrats and Republicans tried to reform and regulate hedge funds, President Schumer and Obama said, no, that's where we get our money. You know, even Goldman Sachs gave Obama $6 billion, and McCain only $1 million. So we've got to awareness, and we've got to organize people. I'm an optimist. I believe that good people can organize and get things done. And we've got to energize people to do this and let them know what these hedge funds do. You know, Soros said, I'll spend $75 million or whatever it takes to protect our industry and elect certain people. And he hides his funds offshore, so we don't know what's going on. And we need more regulation, but we need more ethical, more moral people, and the kind of people that my father was a banker. He only made 10 times as much as the first person or the lowest paid person instead of the 400% that we have today. It's terrible. It's outrageous. These are moral and ethical questions. But anyway, thank you for the analysis.
Yeah, I tend to, I discount the greed argument. I mean, there's been greedy people around a long time, and the question was why did we end up with a social order that actually let greed run the day? And the answer has a lot to do with the fact that this was the only way in which you could actually absorb the surplus. And so I want to drive it back to the surplus absorption question. And part of the politics right now, it seems to me, is who's going to control the surplus and the surplus production and the 3% growth forever? And what are we going to do if we say something like, what would a 0% growth rate economy look like? Well, if you go that far, then you can't redistribute out of growth because there ain't none. What you have to do is you have to come up with a different politics of redistribution. And to do that, the whole political order has to change. I mean, in the United States, what I'd suggest to you is that the Congress is dominated by what I call the Party of Wall Street. And the Party of Wall Street is as deeply embedded in the Democratic Party as it is in the Republican Party. You mentioned Charles Schumer. He's got more money out of Wall Street than anybody else ever. And he's a leading Democratic senator, and again and again and again, he will stop any kind of real attack upon Wall Street if he possibly can. So that there's a political question here, which then goes back into the reform of the political apparatus and all the rest of it. Where I agree with you is that the moral and ethical sentiments that are required to do something about this are far, far further than those which you refer to, which is just sort of decency of behavior within the capitalist system. I think fundamentally the capitalist system is, in itself, about class domination. It's, in that sense, it's about domination, and therefore, to me, it's unethical by definition. Now, it's true that Adam Smith had a definition of property rights which are fundamentally different from those in the neoliberal era. And Adam Smith was very, very, very careful in saying that a system based on private property rights can only succeed if it's surrounded with moral intent and moral concerns. And in the Smithian era, you were not allowed to prevent anybody coming on your land to feed themselves off your crops if they were in imminent danger of starving. I mean, that was the nature. It was a contained limit of property rights. So, yeah, there are ways in which we can start to talk about the degree to which a capitalist system can actually evolve into something which is a zero growth economy, which doesn't place all of these stresses and at the same time delivers social justice. And it has to be social justice around the world, not simply within the United States. It has to be a global kind of project, and that in itself is something that's very, very difficult to organize and even conceptualize. So I think that the issues you raise are a significant element in the situation, but to me, I'm bothered by the way in which sometimes people fail to go to the root of the problem by saying, well, it's about greed and it's about lack of ethics. And because that then says, well, you know, if we just get the ethical and moral kind of circumference right, then the whole world will be okay. And I really don't think that is going to be the case. Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Hello, thank you very much. Actually, I want to ask you something about the very, very good point you made about the legitimacy crisis, and draw another geographical parallel, if you like, in the sense that in the Middle East, the United States government administration, the former administration, has suffered also the legitimacy crisis. There is also interesting parallels in the internal and external issue. Now, Obama has charisma, has, let's say, a reloading of legitimacy in the Middle East.
Yes.
So, especially now, going back to the internal front of the United States, as you also put it quite clearly, that the dispossession process has a very race character, quite clear racial character. It's the black Americans that have been dispossessed and deprived of the populations. And the question is, does Obama, with his own charisma, biography, character, and so on, and of course the whole, let's say, mania that's been introduced with you, and the fact that people felt that we can also have part in this system, can be used as a legitimacy chip or as a legitimacy card for the internal system of the United States, and how long can this hold on later on, because we have the legitimacy crisis actually affecting also the organization.
Property rights position in general. But he is intelligent, pragmatic, and I think would, in a certain circumstance, be prepared to take the kind of action, that go against the presuppositions of the neoliberal order. And that would apply internationally as well. That I think he will be prepared if push comes to shove but he has to be pushed. And our big problem right now is who's going to push him and in which direction is he being pushed. I already mentioned about the party of Wall Street in Congress. He knows that if he wants to maintain the support of even the Democratic Party in Congress, he cannot go too violently against Wall Street. He knows that. Now, the other problem is the sort of international kind of problem, that to the degree that Obama actually does regain, by virtue of his charisma and his history and all the rest of it, some kind of sense of legitimacy for the United States as a very special place where something like this can happen. I mean, I have to say to my European colleagues, can you imagine somebody who is Turkish, of Turkish origin, becoming, Chancellor of Germany? Can you imagine a Maghrebian becoming President of France? Could you imagine a Pakistani becoming Prime Minister of Britain? In other words, the United States has still got something rather special about it, and I think Obama epitomizes that. And I think the way in which the ruling class got behind Obama, even in preference to Hillary Clinton, back in the closing part of the campaign, had a lot to do with they saw him as a major vehicle for trying to establish the legitimacy of the United States in international relations. Now, what he's going to do with it and how he's going to use that is an open question. It depends upon the forces that are amassed around him. I don't think it's a matter of personal choice at all. It's a matter of him having to maneuver between all of these different forces which are ranged around these questions. So my interest, if you like, is to say, well, Obama is going to be there and left to his own devices would probably do this, but what has to be done is forces have to be really arranged around him in such a way as to push him in another, in a radically different direction. But I think he also knows that he has to try, to the degree that he recognizes that he has a certain legitimacy in international affairs, he recognizes he has to earn it. But he's having a hard time with it. I mean, I think the whole kind of question of what's happening to Guantanamo Bay is crucial. I mean, he says he's going to close it, but now it's almost on hold because of this question of what do you do with the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. And the Congress is refusing to allow them to come to the United States and be brought to the United States. So where do you take them? You know, well, he can't engage in rendition, you know, send them to Syria or Egypt or something like that. He can't do that, obviously, because that's not legitimate either. So he's in a very difficult situation over simply a question like that. And I think issues of that kind are likely to come up, particularly around Middle Eastern politics, which he's not going to be able to deal with very well, because I think his room for maneuver is very weak around many of these issues. I think his big fundamental mistake has been to escalate the conflict in Afghanistan. My guess is that actually in 3 years' time, when it comes to re-election, that is going to be a big issue in US political life. Because if the United States is still heavily involved and even more involved in Afghanistan than it now is, and that is the trajectory he's taking, there's going to be a lot of discontent about many of the people who supported him over that issue. If he's come out of the crisis, as I suspect they will have done in some form by the time it comes to his re-election, they will have put enough money in to sort of jack it up so that it's okay. If he gets it there, he'll probably be okay on the economy. But I think the international kind of question, and particularly the war in Afghanistan and the relationship with Pakistan, that is going to be a big kind of issue. So he's likely to waste his legitimacy unless he's very careful. But and I think that, like I say, I think that's his big mistake, and it's going to tell on him as time goes on, and he will be seen as yet another war type president and he's been driven to that, by the way, largely by the Republican right. So that's where he's going to. He'll soon be seen as yet another sort of American imperialist, who's engaging in imperialist militaristic practices in relationship to Afghanistan and Pakistan. So what's different? So those are the sorts of questions, it seems to me, that he's got to solve in a different kind of way. But he's not going to solve them unless the, if you like, constellation of forces that are around him really change.
Mr. Harvey, my name is John Hayden. I'm a master's candidate in political studies. I wanted to pick up on a point you made about the lack of resistance in universities. And I wonder if that might in part be explained by knowledge-based economy models that expect university departments to be producing commercializable knowledge in order to substantiate their existence. And if that technology, innovation focus, which is an urban phenomenon which exists in for example, the biotech clusters in California and so on, is increasingly part of this, what you were talking about. Thank you.
It's interesting, the right wing in the United States, many of them were originally Trotskyists, and actually they appreciated the Maoist strategy, and they had a Maoist strategy in relationship to universities. They said in the mid-1970s, we cannot challenge the universities directly. They're too hard. So, like Mao said about the peasant revolution, you occupy the countryside around, they said, well, we set up think tanks. We fund think tanks all around the universities, and then we gradually invade the universities until the universities become totally neoliberal, corporatist, and we absolutely get rid of almost all the radical thinking that typically would find in universities. Universities complied with this, of course, by actually changing their own definition of radicalism. So you actually change radicalism from some sort of engagement with political economy and Marxism to engagement with identity politics. And, so the humanities programs became full of, actually very interesting stuff about, queer theory, gay and lesbian rights, anti-racist struggles, feminism, you know, race and, you know, all of those kinds of questions, which is actually crucially important, provided you actually don't forget the dimension of class and the political economy of class. But in fact, they basically said class doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, you know, my particular identity and identity politics. So there was a kind of betrayal of the intellectuals, I think, partly through that shift, which is fine with capital. You know, capitalism loves multiculturalism. I mean, what could be better for niche marketing than having multiculturalists around? You know, it's great. So but the one thing they don't like is the niche market called, you know, Marxism. They don't like that at all. They can't find a good, you know, they can't sell much in there, you know. So so yeah, I mean, universities have become very, very conservative places. And, you know, in the same way that it was very difficult to change the kind of leftist-leaning kind of university structure, and it took maybe 20 years to do it. So we've got to start to think about a 20-year project to transform the universities back to a more, it's a long-term project. And it's very interesting. I mean, we try to have discussions about how to understand the political economy of the present situation, and when you try to assemble a group of people around, they're all about my age. And you kind of go, this is horrible, you know. I mean, I don't like talking to old geezers like me. I'd rather talk to young people, you know. And I kind of go, oh God, I can't have another one of these meetings with all of these old geezers like me, you know. And I don't like it. And so you get into this dilemma. Fortunately, I do have something which came from my own education, which was my grandmother was terribly important in actually corrupting me politically. She was a great Labour supporter. My family wasn't at all, but my grandmother was. So I have a grandparent theory of knowledge, and I say, you know, us grandparents can tell you, don't take any notice what your parents say, they're full of bullshit, you know. And you just listen to me, you know. And then you go off and make the world in a different way. And I did what my grandmother said, so I'm rather proud of my grandmother. And so you know, so grandparent theory of knowledge, so I hope will work.